The global reaction to COVID-19 was one of the world's great fuck-around eras, as countries all over the world implemented never-before-tried population-scale non-medical interventions including lockdowns, social distancing, masks and more, followed by, of course, the world's largest clinical trial, as experimental mRNA jabs were rolled out in their billions. Now, at the end of 2025, we are deep into the find out era, and even among official publications, they're having to admit to some alarming outcomes. I'm going to read from a study out of South Korea, which was a population-level study including all 51 million residents of South Korea, of which some 40 million are classified as being fully vaccinated against SARS-CoV-2. The results of this study are alarming, but not unexpected, and for obvious reasons, this is going to be one of those videos where I do my best not to editorialize or add anything, sticking only to what's published in this study and nothing more. But there is a bit of background needed before we get into the numbers. South Korea is heralded to this day by the World Bank, among others, as exemplars in global health of a pandemic response done right. It's notable that they did not resort to population-level lockdowns or business closures the way that so many other countries did, notably Australia and in particular the state of Victoria. Rather, they used early detection and contact tracing to target their resources to where they would actually make a difference, onto those who were actually infected. And that makes their long-term health outcomes particularly relevant and powerful, because it cannot be argued that any negative outcomes now are due to a poor response to the pandemic back then. There are a few other points and notes that I will make along the way, but again, I'm going to try and let the numbers speak for themselves as much as possible. Because they do speak for themselves. And they vindicate many of the warnings that I, and probably you, and certainly many others, were giving at the time, during 2020 and 21, warning that some of our interventions, some of our cures, were likely to be worse than the disease, especially among younger populations, where the risk from COVID-19 was vanishingly small. Sadly, this enormous study proves conclusively that we were right. And no, I'm not happy to say that at all. Before we dive into the numbers, my name's Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and I help busy people like you to cut through the crap, make sense of the nonsense, and keep up with the world as it changes around us. Or in this case, as it finally admits what many of us knew and expected already. I am 100% viewer supported. I don't have any advertisers or sponsors for obvious reasons. I talk about things that most sponsors would get nervous about. And by remaining 100% independent, I can bring you stories like this one without fear of upsetting a sponsor. And in the case of videos like this one, it's not uncommon for me to be demonetized on YouTube as well. So if you appreciate me keeping you up to date with this story among others, then please support my work by buying me a coffee via the button at topherfield.net. And if you like my videos, then you will love my books, my DVDs and merch, all of which is available at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. And remember that in just a few days' time, the end of November, I'm discontinuing 5 of my designs. So head over to Good People Break Bad Laws and grab them while stocks last, because once they're gone, they're never coming back. All right, let's get into this study. You'll find it at the website sciencedirect.com. It's titled Incidence of Respiratory Infections After the COVID-19 Pandemic and its Association of Vaccination Among Entire Populations in Korea. This study is listed as in press journal pre-proof. What does that mean? Well, it means that this study has been peer-reviewed and is now in the process of being published. I'm going to say that again. This is a peer-reviewed study. First, I'm going to take you through their data on the incidence of respiratory diseases and then get to the breakdowns of vaccinated versus unvaccinated at the end. I'm going to take you through the graphs that they provide in this study, which compare the observed incidence of a range of respiratory illnesses with what would have been expected in a business-as-usual no-COVID type of scenario. Here's the upper respiratory tract infections. You can see that during the first 2 years of the pandemic, they dropped to improbably low levels. More on that later. And then they came roaring back, and far from stabilizing back to pre-pandemic levels, there has been a clear upward trend in URIs, upper respiratory tract infections, that at least as of the end of 2024, that upward trend shows no sign of slowing down. Now keep in mind that these are the graphs for the entire population, all the demographics. There are certain demographics, particularly younger people, who are getting absolutely smashed right now. More on that at the end. Now the story with pneumonia is less pronounced. We do see once again that it apparently pretty much disappeared during COVID, and it's making a strong comeback, although it must be said, not yet to levels higher than the pre-pandemic trend, although I would say watch this space because the rising trend up to the end of 2024 is pretty clear. And there's something funny going on with their influenza-like illness data. Not only do they claim that there was literally no influenza whatsoever during COVID, leading to legitimate questions about misdiagnosis. If you look at the blue dotted line, the projection, they're claiming that ILIs are expected to have higher and higher minimum levels year after year during summer as we go through the time series. Notice in the observed data before the pandemic that influenza drops to 0 during each summer, but in the dotted blue line projection, it never gets to 0, and in fact the minimum level in each successive summer rises higher and higher. There's something funny going on there. You might think that the annual increase is to allow for increasing population, but South Korea's population went into decline 5 years ago and is showing no sign of growing again anytime soon. So I don't know what they're doing with those rising minimums or why they're doing it. But we will see in the data that we get to a little bit later on that this might be an attempt to game the figures. More on that in a minute. But notice before we leave this graph that in their last flu season, in this graph, their winter of 2023 and the start of 2024, they set a new record high for influenza. Interesting. Again, with the common cold, we see that it's supposedly all but disappeared during COVID, came roaring back afterwards, and like the others, has established a solid upwards trend ever since. And once again, I want to point out these rising minimums in the dotted blue estimated line. Again, there's no good reason that I know of for that to be the case. Tuberculosis, a disease which was steadily declining, then flatlined. Although it does appear to be trending down again towards the end, but you can clearly see that it is now much higher than would be expected given the trend that was established before COVID. Whooping cough, or pertussis. This one's, shall we say, interesting, don't you think? So, respiratory diseases are rising at a population-wide level pretty much across the board. That seems clear. But what's not visible in those graphs is why. For that, we need to look at the breakdown of vaccinated versus unvaccinated. This study breaks people down into 4 main groups. Those with 4 or more jabs, those with 3, those with 2, and those with either 0 or 1. They don't separate out those with none at all from those with 1. Why not? Well, perhaps that data wasn't available because maybe the government lumped everyone with less than 2 jabs into the unvaccinated category. Or perhaps they're playing games. I'm not sure, but we can pretty safely assume that whatever trend is visible when comparing the 0 and 1 groups with the other groups would be even stronger for a 0-only group. The columns you see here are the 4 different groups, 0 or 1 jab on the left, 4+ jabs on the right, and 2 and 3 jabs in between. It's notable that in the case of influenza, they claim in their Model 3, which is the model which is meant to be the most accurate because it's the model where they adjust and allow for the most variables like demographics, the timing of injections, etc. They claim in Model 3 that more COVID jabs led to fewer influenza-like illnesses, and that even having 2 COVID jabs reduces your likelihood of an ILI by over 25%, which looks pretty convincing. But that's a curious finding given that according to the data in this graph, some 40 million people fit into those various jabbed categories, which means that as a population of 51 million, with 40 million of them protected, the incidence of ILIs should have dropped markedly. And yet, according to the data from the same study, this graph here says, influenza's doing just fine, thank you very much. Again, this is the one that raises the most questions for me. It's where we see that rising minimum in summer that makes no sense, that blue dotted line. And I'll be honest, when it comes to the influenza data in this study, my spider senses are tingling. It really does look like they're doing something funny with these stats because this and this shouldn't be happening in the same study. However, I am going to put that aside because I don't have an answer. I'm going to move on to the ones that are unquestionable, in my opinion. Upper respiratory tract infections. The more jabs you have, the more susceptible you are to an infection. This is again using their Model 3 where they've made all the adjustments to allow for variations in demographics, etc. It's even worse with the common cold. 4+ jabs makes you more than twice as likely to get the common cold, adjusted for population data, and at a 95% confidence interval, there is a band of 2.18 to 2.25 times as likely for you to get the common cold if you have 4+ jabs. So the rising trend we see here in the population-wide data for upper respiratory tract infections is because people with 4 or more jabs are now more susceptible to those infections. So says this peer-reviewed study of more than 50 million people. The rising trend we see in the population-wide data for post-pandemic common colds? Well, it's because people with 4 or more jabs are now more susceptible to those infections. So says, again, this peer-reviewed study of more than 50 million people. I'm not going to dive into the raw data behind this study, except to mention that when you break it down by age, the negative outcomes for children are worse than what they are for adults. Which means that it brings me no joy to say that this study confirms what many of us feared. The experimental mRNA jabs, which were rolled out on an unprecedented global scale without any long-term safety data, they're now having consequences that will still be with us long after COVID-19 is a distant memory. There's a lot more that I'd like to say, but because censorship is not yet completely a thing of the past on YouTube, I do need to be a little bit careful. You can read the study for yourself if you'd like to. It's not pretty. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who supports my work and makes it possible for me to bring stories like this one to light. I couldn't do this if I was dependent on YouTube revenue or on advertisers or sponsors. So thank you to everyone who's bought me a coffee. And if you've appreciated this video and you'd like to help me keep bringing you stories like this one, then please buy me a coffee via the button at topherfield.net. And if you like my videos, then you will love my books about government, law, power and human rights and civil disobedience. And you will find my books along with my DVDs and my t-shirts and hoodies at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. Yes, I am also discontinuing 5 of my designs of shirt in just a few days' time at the end of November. So make sure that you go to goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com and grab your favorites now while stocks last. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. The algorithm loves you, and so do I. Please like, comment, subscribe, and as always, think free.